Okay, hi everyone. Welcome to the pre-recorded lecture for class number 7. So class number 7 brings us to the final topic area of my section of spatial practice, and I've called this topic area, What Does Space Look Like? And much like our transition from talking about procedural spaces and then utopia as a constructed space, there are quite a few links between the utopia discussions and these discussions of what does space look like. And this section will be talking about things like perspective and projection systems and how is space, three-dimensional space, represented on two-dimensional screens, which is really, the basis of what Blender is doing for us. Okay, so the agenda for class 7, you'll have noticed that last week I've shifted the balance a little bit to focusing on texts a little bit more. So this week in class, we will finish off the close reading exercise we did on the François Choi text. I'd love to read through the summaries that you made and see if, as a group, we can really extract all of the meaning from this text. And I'd like to start talking a little bit more about your presentation topics and potential essay questions and case studies. Then we'll do an abstract writing exercise where we'll all write an essay abstract together, just so we can get into the habit of structuring paragraphs correctly so that they communicate and introduce an essay in an effective way. And this should help you prepare both for the presentation in week 8 as well as the essay that's due in week 10. Then we're going to do another close reading exercise on the text for this week, which is the paper by Jan Crick. And I'd say it's a much simpler text than the François Choi. So hopefully, it should be a lot easier than the first one. And then at the end, I'll try to leave some time to go through your Blender exercises. Okay, so the text for this week is called Axonometry, A Matter of Perspective. And it's quite a nice historical examination of the history of what we call parallel projection systems. And parallel projection systems, as I'll show you in this lecture, they appear in lots of different historical cases. Jan Crick talks about how we find parallel projection in Chinese and Japanese scroll painting, and also how we find it in architecture and how we find it in computer games. And we've encountered a little bit of this already when we look at the orthographic camera in Blender. So what that orthographic camera does is it removes the vanishing point from the visualization and gives us this parallel look. And so the paper for this week is really looking at the history of that type of spatial drawing. So a little bit about the author. Jan Crick was a former Japan correspondent for various media organizations. He was the managing editor of the Asia 2000 and author of Quantum Physics and Artificial Intelligence in the 21st Century, Lessons Learned from China. So he kind of has a journalistic and foreign correspondent background, but he's done some interesting and very accessible writings on cybernetics and Chinese philosophy. Also note that I haven't read his book, the monograph that was just mentioned, but on that topic, and if you're interested in these links between Chinese philosophy and cybernetics, another great book to check out is Yu Kui's The Question Concerning Technology in China, an essay in Cosmotechnics, which was published by Urbanomic in 2016. And also there's a little bit of this connection explored in Hui's most recent book, Recursivity and Contingency. So these are much more difficult texts, but if you're interested in this relationship between Chinese philosophy and cybernetics, these are some interesting things that you might enjoy. Okay, so what we're going to be talking about this week are the relationship between, oblique projection and isometric projection. I've put this image together. If you see the combination of these little characters on the screen, the little army character is from the computer game StarCraft, And then there's a character that I've photoshopped out of a Chinese painting manual. And the first thing you should notice in an image like this is that the people are the same size, no matter where they are on the screen. So unlike a perspective system where we would expect that a representation of a person would get larger and smaller depending on how close they are to a camera, in parallel drawing systems like oblique projection or isometric projection, we don't have that scale relative to distance question. And it allows for all sorts of interesting things to happen. We can see here that the computer game element is obviously there. You know, this looks a little bit like a real-time strategy computer game, which I'll move to in a second. But also, it looks a little bit like a scroll painting. So if you look at an image like this is a Chinese scroll painting from the Qing dynasty of the southern inspection tour of the Kangxi Emperor. And we can see also, if you look particularly at the buildings, that it's using a parallel projection system. The lines of the buildings remain parallel, they're not converging to any vanishing point. And when architecture was represented in Chinese scroll painting, this is typically the system that was most often used. And the benefit of this, obviously, is that scrolls are very, very long. And if you don't have a vanishing point, it's very easy to continue the spatial system forever. You know, these sorts of images can be added to infinitely on the x-axis, but also we can tile them up on the y-axis. This is an interesting historical image. Also, it was commissioned by the Kangxi Emperor and painted by a team of artists led by the master painter Wang Hui. And the Kangxi Emperor at this point was inspecting the flood levee systems, I believe, in the Yangtze River Delta, I think. And so for those of you who are aware of Chinese dynastic history, the management of waterways and flooding systems was incredibly important to the health of the nation and the health of the government. And in this instance, the use of a parallel projection system has been used to tell a spatial story. That as you look through the scroll, as you move from right to left, you can follow the journey of the emperor and all of the different activities that were done. And using this parallel landscape that continues on, it uses, I'd say it uses space to tell a historical story. And in a very specific sense, this is what's happening. This is another Chinese scroll painting, in this case a small section cropped from Spring Morning in the Han Palace by Qiao Ying, another very interesting painting. But I've drawn these lines here to show you really what's going on. What we have is the x-axis, the horizontal axis, all lines remain parallel, and they also are horizontal. That means that if we draw a cube, the front of the cube is always facing the viewer. So all of these buildings will always have one face parallel to us, the viewer. And then the y-axis is always vertical. There's no three-point perspective. It's not like when you look at from the bottom of a building up to the top and you can see that the lines get closer together. In oblique projection, which is a parallel projection, we don't have any of that perspective convergence. All lines remain parallel on the y-axis. And then on the z-axis, on the depth axis, we can also see that all the lines are parallel. So that means if you were to draw a space like this, essentially all you need to do is set up these three angles and then make sure all of your subsequent lines remain parallel. And much like the painting we looked at previously, the obvious benefit here is that we can move across the image to the left and right, and all of the space continues to make sense. And what you'll find is that these sort of parallel projection systems also exist in computer games, very common. Most commonly in the game genre called real-time strategy gaming. I've just forgotten to loop this video, so I might have to play it a few times. I might just stop it there. If you look at these images here, these strategy games use a form of parallel projection. If you look at the architecture of the castle here, all the lines on one axis here are parallel to each other, and all the lines on the other axis are also parallel to each other, and all the vertical lines are parallel also. So this, you'll notice, is slightly different to what we saw in the Chao-Ing painting. I'll show you why. So this is a screenshot from StarCraft 2. Here you'll see that the x-axis is no longer parallel, or is no longer horizontal. The x-axis is at an angle, and the z-axis is also at an angle, and the y-axis remains vertical. The function is exactly the same. What we have is a space that we can endlessly extend either left and right or up and down, and we also see that all of the characters remain the same size. Now, in the original version of, or actually in the current version of games like this, they're actually now running on 3D game engines. So this is actually using a 3D simulation. But in the original version of these games, they were not using 3D graphics. They were using 2D graphics. And the trick was, which is what's explained very well in Jan Crick's paper, the trick was that if you want to have a character move from the lower part of the screen to the upper part of the screen, you don't have to run any complex calculations. You don't have to have the figure get larger or smaller. All you need are images of the figure from one side, from a little bit turned one way, a little bit turned the other, and maybe from the reverse. And depending on which direction the figure is walking, you can show the figure from these angles. You don't actually have to have a full 3D simulation of any of the characters. And this meant that in the early days of real-time strategy computer games like Command and Conquer, I can't think of any others off the top of my head, Red Alert, same game, they used this quite old graphics technology from, as Jan Crick describes, from both architecture and Chinese painting to make really complex simulations where there could be hundreds of moving characters on the screen, but the computer power needed to make this spatial illusion is kept to a minimum. And this spawned a very popular genre of games. And so even though we have much more powerful computers these days, this way of looking at space has remained very popular. So to get technical, what we're talking about with these systems are all these categories here on the left, all the ones that are called parallel projections. And the ones that are on the right, which we'll talk about more next week, are probably more familiar to you. Perspective systems, 1-point perspective, 2-point perspective, 3-point perspective. These are the things that we mainly use in Blender when we have a sort of simulated camera. However, in Blender we can also use the orthographic camera, and when we're drawing, we can always decide what type of projection system to use. Now, in one of our earlier lectures, we discussed how we can move conceptually from 3-dimensional space down to 2-dimensional space and finally 1-dimensional space. And really, what a perspective or a graphical projection system actually is simply a way of removing the third dimension. Because remember that the screen that you're looking at right now is 2-dimensional. It has a vertical axis and a horizontal axis. There is never anything 3-dimensional on the screen. The screen is flat. So what we have when we look at screens are different ways to project the missing spatial dimension, the depth dimension, using the limitation of 2-dimensional space. So as we spoke about when we tried to make a 4-dimensional shape in Blender, the tesseract, what all of our drawing systems are, in a spatial sense, are ways to fake or simulate the third dimension. And there are so many different ways of doing this that come from so many different industries and applications. And what we're looking at with parallel projections are really kind of the technological and the artistic history of some of the ones that fall in this category here. So we can see the scroll painting category that we saw with the Chao-Ing painting and the Kangxi Emperor painting fall within the oblique class. We always have one side of the shape parallel to the viewer and the other side goes off at an angle. And there are different versions of the oblique class. In the axonometric class, which is what Jan Crick is talking about mainly, we have the isometric, which is what we see in the computer game. The cube is no longer having any side of it facing the viewer. Both sides go off to an angle. And then dimetric and trimetric, really these are variations where the angles are changing and they have different applications in different industries. For example, the cabinet projection, what you'll see here is that one side of the cube has been shortened. So here, this square remains a square, but this distance is actually probably half this distance if you measured them on the page. And that's because cabinet projection is usually for people who make furniture and things like that. So if you want to draw a long table on a diagram, maybe the table won't fit on a piece of paper, but if you want to keep accurate measurements, you can just say, okay, everything that's on the oblique side is reduced by 1/2 or something like that. So all of these systems really come out of different historical use cases. And that's what's interesting about Jan Crick's paper, is that he tries to explain why we have these different drawing systems, how they get used differently, but also how some of them maybe share some common historical origins. Okay, moving on. Okay, so let's get a little bit more specific into axonometry and parallel projection. So here I've drawn a building and I've drawn it on some grid paper, and we can see that both sides of the building are going off at consistent angles. So every window, every ledge on one side of the building are parallel, going off at one angle, and on the other side of the building, they're all parallel, going off at another angle. So the way that this works is that, generally speaking, this system will have a particular rule, and it's usually something like each angle might be 30 degrees from the horizontal axis. It's usually something like that. If you go to the Wikipedia page for isometric projection, it will tell you what these angles are, and usually it's something like 30 degrees. And we can see one of the fun things we can do with this system is, if I've drawn one building, I can actually just copy and paste as many buildings as I want, and because there's no scaling, we don't have to worry about the buildings looking perspectively incorrect. If these buildings had been drawn in a perspective system, you can't duplicate them like this, because all the vanishing points are unique and they wouldn't all be projecting to the right point in the page. However, when there's no vanishing point, one of the fantastic flexibilities of parallel systems is that you can use duplication graphically and make wonderfully complex images by simply drawing one part of a building and copying and pasting it. Very similar to what we're able to do in Blender, and Blender then does all the perspective calculations for us, sometimes a little slowly, as we find with the rendering. And you can see that I've put these people on the screen to show you that it can spatially make sense now to have people who are all the same size in different parts of the screen, and we can kind of imagine that they might be able to walk from one part of the image to another. They still seem to rest on the screen comfortably. And another trick that I've done is I've added in what's called like a cast shadow under the objects, the people and the plants, and that just helps to give the illusion that these people are connected to this imaginary space that I've drawn on the page. So if we move on to back to oblique projection here, you can see that we have essentially the same rules. We have all sides of each face are parallel, verticals remain parallel, horizontals remain parallel, and the projected side remains parallel. However, now in oblique projection, the one face is parallel to the viewer and its lines are horizontal, and the projected face all goes off at one consistent angle. So instead of having two angles going away from the viewer, we have one face of the building parallel to us looking at the picture, and then the other side going away, in the same way that we saw in the scroll painting. Now, so the rule here is very, very similar, but instead we're just projecting one side off, and that side is usually at 45 degrees. And again, if you look up the technical definitions of oblique projection, usually you'll find the quotation of what the angle of projection is. But for oblique projection, usually something like 45 degrees. And again, we can have all the same benefits of the parallel system. You know, here I only drew one building by hand, and then I simply, you know, copied and pasted it, and I had a city. And again, I've made the people a little smaller this time, so you can see them a little, maybe in a closer scale to the building. And all of these people are exactly the same size. I've also just copied and pasted them around. So you can see from an animation perspective, here the potential is very large, because we can have elements that are really don't have any complex scaling, and we can have a lot of figures doing all sorts of different things without ever having to worry about scale. And if you have a look at the video that I've cut in now, this is one of my own artworks, and in this artwork I was using this exact trick. There's no 3D animation in this artwork. I'm actually using just a video camera and a green screen, and I've 3D modeled a background which I've put in oblique projection, and then I've simply reduced the scale from my figures, so that when my figure walks towards the camera, I make him get smaller, and when he walks away from the camera, I make him get larger, just so that the figure actually then stays the same size all the time. And once you've got that, you can use the figure in this sort of computer game type animation effect. And you know, it doesn't really take a very powerful computer to make something like this. Okay, so some other examples of when we see parallel spaces in art and cultural works. This is a kind of an interesting computer game by the independent game company Molleindustria. This game is called Alea. I think you can still download it if you just Google the name. Maybe I'll put the link in the description of the video. And it uses an isometric city rendered in this quite beautiful, very plain ambient occlusion effect. And it tells a story just by allowing you to interact and click on these buildings. And the buildings sort of become like a graph, and they get larger and smaller as their values go up and down. And it tries to tell a story about urban planning, property investment, and the life cycle of a city. But all is done using this isometric projection. Another example is the quite long-running art project by a British artist called Paul Noble. So in about 1998, Paul Noble started exhibiting large-scale drawings of this imaginary city that he called Nobson, Newtown. And if you look closely at the architectural elements, you'll see that Paul Noble always draws in oblique projection. That is, that the front face of the architecture is parallel to the viewer. We have horizontal lines. And then the projected side always goes off at the same angle, which is probably something like 45 degrees. So Paul Noble, I think he ran this project for about 10 years, and the beauty of it was that he could always add more pieces of paper. So I saw this exhibited, I think, in the Sydney Biennale, must have been around maybe 2002 or something like that. And there were these amazing drawings that were all connected together, and the reason he could connect them like this was because he was using a parallel projection system. And he used this system to create this city, and then he used the city to tell these kind of amazing stories. So the city of Nobson, Newtown had no inhabitants, and so we read the stories through the ruins of the buildings. And if you look very carefully, you can see that the buildings themselves are actually a font. They're sort of an oblique projection architectural font, and in this image the buildings spell out the words Nob slum. So this is a impoverished area of Nobson, Newtown. This image is the entrance to the Nob Park. And there's actually a great website by someone called Duncan McLaren where I found some great background information on Paul Noble's project. So I got some of these more detailed images from Duncan McLaren's website. But this is a quote that McLaren reproduces. It's from the Contemporary Visual Arts Journal, issue number 23. And they write, they're describing Nobson, Newtown, and they say, it's treeless and empty of wildlife. A tent, similar to the one on offer, has been blown away. The knob rocks that were weighing down the canvas edges have been strewn to reveal a skeletal framework. Nob Job Club is in the background. On the plateau, a barren dome flanked by disturbing grids. I turn away from the desert. The big-eyed hare rearing up on its hind legs intimidates me now, makes me feel guilty. Am I implicated in the destruction of the countryside just because I thought for a moment that I might like to camp for a night in Nob Park? This seems a bit harsh. So the writer here is reading into this this world that Noble is creating, and the writer is interpreting what's called environmental storytelling. And environmental storytelling is where you don't necessarily have events that occur in the environment. You use traces left in a spatial environment to suggest that a story has taken place. And I think this is really a technique that, that Noble uses very well. So this image is from Noble's 2004 exhibition at the Whitechapel Gallery. And here he presented the sprawling architectural ruin of the centre of Nobson, Newtown, called Nobson Central. And this image, it looks a lot like what European cities looked like at the end of World War II after they'd been bombed, or maybe cities in the Balkans in the 1990s after there was a lot of war and destruction there. And if you look closely at this image, it's actually writing out an entire poem by T.S. Eliot called The Wasteland, or part of the poem, and starts with the lines that April is the cruelest month. And on McLaren's blog, he actually does a great effort in trying to read out the entire poem just by trying to decipher every single word. And so some of the words here that McLaren has deciphered are April is the cruelest month, month ding lacks out of the dead land, mixing memory and desire, warm covering earth, ed tubers, summer surprised us coming off we Hofgarten, and drank for and bin kleiner Gard dusch, staying down much of in winter. So what we get is kind of a crumbled, ruined version of the poem itself. And so there's a wonderful spatial game that Noble is playing with us here, where he uses architecture as words, but he ruins the architecture. And as he ruins the architecture, he also ruins he treats the poem itself like something that is crumbling and decaying. So even as we read it, it's as if the words have started to break apart and the sentences are no longer complete. So I like using this example because Paul Noble, he uses the fictional city of Nobson, Newtown as sort of like a spatial container in which he collects and rearranges his own thoughts about history, about cities, about the things that happen in so many different places and times that sometimes for us it's hard to connect together. And as an artist, Noble uses spatial construction to collect all of his thoughts and to put them all back together into this ruined city where it's almost like the space becomes his mind or memory, and he's rearranging these thoughts in a spatial architectural manner. And I think, you know, this might be something that could give you ideas in how you also might like to approach your work. So another example I'd like to explore is a much more recent work. This is a work called The New Deep by Sunwoo, Hoon and Mijoon. This work I saw exhibited in 2019, and what the artists have done is they've used this scrolling format of the web browser as an equivalent of the painted scroll. They use isometric projection, and unfortunately I can't find an online version of this work anymore, but basically the entire work is just one web page that scrolls down. And instead of a scroll where you scroll sideways and learn the story, you simply scroll down through this artwork and you learn, well, they sort of do a spatial storytelling of their own. And it's quite interesting. They combine architectural elements with things that just look like they're floating on the screen of mobile phones, or floating TV elements, or floating web browsers. But because they use isometric projection in a very consistent way, it all has this sort of spatial consistency, and we can read it as one world. And the image on the left here shows how the work is installed. What they did at the gallery is they had just one flat screen TV, and you could literally just scroll up and down through their world, and it was incredibly effective. Really, you know, it's simply just an image. I think it might have had, some of the images might have been GIFs, but because they were very clever with their spatial construction, it all just read as one world. And I bring up this artwork because we're using web browsers as, you know, the final presentation format. This is such an interesting work because it turns the web browser space into an artistic medium in a very spatially sophisticated but quite simple way. So I think it's a wonderful example. And if you Google their names and the title of the work, hopefully you can find an online version of the work that you can scroll through. Okay, so for this week, as I mentioned at the beginning, I want you to I want you to finish the close reading exercise we did of the Françoise Choi text. And I also want you to read Jan Crick's text before class, and we will do our second close reading exercise. Now, the lecture I've just given you tells you quite a lot about the historical things that Jan Crick is talking about, so they shouldn't be too unfamiliar. And this text is a little bit simpler to understand than the first close reading exercise we did. And I hope you enjoy it. I think it's a nice article. Okay, so that's it for the lecture. I look forward to seeing you all in class, and I look forward to our second close reading exercise. Okay, bye-bye everyone.